Don't touch him." The words landed cold and precise, cutting clean through the soft hum of violins and polite laughter drifting across the marble ballroom, as Richard Hale's hand closed firmly around his son's shoulder and pulled him back, just inches before the woman in the service uniform could reach him. And for a moment, everything seemed to pause in that strange, fragile space between intention and rejection. The crystal chandeliers above casting fractured light across polished floors while dozens of well-dressed guests pretended not to stare, their conversations thinning into whispers as they watched the scene unfold at the edge of the room, where Ethan Hale stood rigid and trembling, his small fingers curled inward like he was holding onto something invisible, something slipping, something no one else in that room could see. And Naomi Carter froze exactly where she was, one hand still slightly extended, palm open, not demanding, not insisting, just there, her posture quiet, grounded, as if she understood that the space between her and the boy mattered more than anything she could say, while Richard's expression hardened with the kind of control that came from years of being obeyed without question, his tailored suit catching the warm amber glow of the lights as he positioned himself between them like a barrier, like a rule that could not be broken. And somewhere behind them a server passed by with a tray of sparkling water, the faint clink of glass almost too loud in the silence that followed, because Ethan's breathing had changed, shallow now, uneven, his eyes not on his father, not on the crowd, but fixed somewhere lower, somewhere closer to the ground where Naomi's hand had been, and Naomi slowly lowered it, not out of fear, not out of submission, but with a kind of deliberate calm that felt almost out of place in a room built on appearances, her gaze steady, observant. The way someone looks when they are listening to something deeper than sound, something beneath the noise, and the soft fabric of her sleeve brushed against her wrist as she moved, revealing a thin silver bracelet that caught a shard of chandelier light and reflected it in a quiet, flickering pulse across the marble floor, a detail so small it should have gone unnoticed. But it didn't, not to Ethan, whose eyes shifted, drawn to that glint, that rhythm, that single point of calm in a room that was suddenly too bright, too loud, too much, while Richard's grip tightened just slightly, protective, impatient, unaware of the shift happening inches away from him, unaware that control was slipping not because of defiance, but because he had never learned how to see the world the way his son did. And Naomi, still silent, slowly lowered herself to the ground, the cool marble pressing through the thin sole of her shoes as she sat, not approaching, not retreating, simply placing herself within reach of a space Ethan could choose, her hand resting gently on the floor beside her, fingers relaxed, unmoving, like an anchor waiting to be found, while the music in the background swelled again, polite applause rising from somewhere across the room, completely disconnected from the fragile moment unfolding here. And for the first time since entering that ballroom, Ethan shifted his weight forward, just slightly, his breathing catching on the edge of something new, something uncertain, something possible, as the distance between him and Naomi no longer felt like a barrier, but an invitation. The distance between them held for one long second, then another, stretching thin like glass under pressure, until Ethan's foot moved forward by less than an inch. A hesitant shift that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not know how to look for it. But Naomi saw it immediately, not as progress to celebrate, not as something to react to, but as a signal to remain exactly as she was, steady, present, unchanging, her breathing slow and even as if she were anchoring something unseen in the space around them, while the faint hum of the ballroom lights seemed louder now, mixing with the distant clatter of silverware and the muted rhythm of music that no longer belonged to this moment. And Richard's hand, still resting near his son's shoulder, loosened without him fully realizing it, his fingers no longer gripping but hovering, uncertain, as though he had stepped into a situation where none of his instincts applied. And that unfamiliarity unsettled him more than anything else, because for years he had solved problems with precision, with direction, with control, yet here, control had only made things worse, and he could see it now in the way Ethan did not respond to him, did not look at him, but instead remained focused on the quiet figure sitting on the marble floor, a woman who had said almost nothing and yet seemed to understand everything that mattered in this moment. and Naomi's eyes softened just slightly as she noticed the change in Ethan's breathing, the sharp edges smoothing into something more consistent, more grounded, her hand still resting against the cool surface, fingers unmoving, offering a point of stability without expectation, while the silver bracelet at her wrist caught the light again, a soft flicker that reflected in Ethan's eyes as he leaned forward another fraction. His small frame still tense, but no longer retreating, no longer resisting the space between fear and curiosity. And Naomi spoke again, her voice barely above the ambient noise, gentle and measured. "You do not have to come any closer." The words placed carefully, intentionally, removing pressure rather than adding to it. And something in that absence of demand seemed to settle deeper into Ethan's awareness, his shoulders lowering just slightly, his fingers uncurling one at a time, as if releasing a grip he did not realize he had been holding, while Richard watched in silence, the weight of the moment pressing against his understanding, because he had spent years trying to guide, to instruct, to fix, and none of it had worked. Yet here, in the span of a few quiet minutes, something was shifting in a way he could not explain, and that realization did not feel like relief, not yet, but like the beginning of something unfamiliar, something that required him to stand still and witness rather than act. And as Ethan took another small step forward, the polished marble reflecting his movement in a faint, distorted echo beneath him, the distance between him and Naomi narrowing to something that no longer felt impossible, only uncertain, waiting for a choice that had to be his alone. The air between them felt thinner now, not with tension but with something quieter, something fragile that could break if touched too quickly. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, seated on the cool marble floor, as if she had all the time in the world, her posture relaxed but intentional, her presence steady like a soft rhythm beneath the noise of the room, while Ethan stood just a few feet away, his body no longer rigid but still uncertain, his gaze shifting between her hand and the faint shimmer of the bracelet that caught the chandelier light in slow, pulsing reflections, and each flicker seemed to draw him closer, not by force, not by command, but by something he could understand in his own way, something consistent, something safe. While behind him Richard exhaled again, longer this time, his shoulders lowering slightly as he watched a moment unfold that he had never been able to create, his mind searching for logic, for explanation, but finding none that fit, because nothing about this followed the rules he knew. And for the first time he did not interrupt, did not step in, did not try to redirect what was happening, even as every instinct told him to maintain control. And Naomi sensed that shift without looking at him, the absence of interference creating a space where something real could continue, her voice soft again, barely carried by the air. "You are okay." The words simple, unlayered, spoken not as reassurance to convince, but as a truth offered, without expectation, and Ethan's breathing steadied further, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that no longer fought itself, his fingers loosening completely now as his hand lifted slightly from his side, hovering in the space between hesitation and action. And Naomi did not move, did not adjust, did not even lean forward, because she understood that the moment had to belong entirely to him, that any shift from her could turn invitation into pressure. And the room around them seemed to dim in importance, the music blending into a distant echo, the guests becoming shapes rather than people, all of it fading behind the quiet focus of a child deciding whether to trust, while the polished marble beneath them reflected the faint outline of movement as Ethan took one final small step forward, closing the last of the distance that had once felt impossible, his hand now lifted just slightly higher, trembling not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of choice. And for a brief second he paused, his eyes fixed on Naomi's still hand, as if memorizing the shape of it, the stillness of it, the promise of it, and then, slowly, carefully, he extended his fingers until they brushed against hers, a light, tentative contact that carried more meaning than any words spoken in that room. And Naomi did not react with surprise, did not tighten her grip or pull him closer. She simply allowed the contact to exist, her hand remaining warm and steady beneath his, offering presence without demand, while Richard's breath caught behind them, the sound barely audible but filled with something deeper than shock, something closer to realization as he watched his son do something no one had seen in years, not because he had been taught, not because he had been told, but because he had been given the space to choose. And in that quiet, delicate moment, the world Richard had built on certainty and control began to shift in a way he could not stop, and for the first time, he did not want to. For a moment, nothing else existed beyond the quiet contact between their hands. The light touch of Ethan's fingers resting against Naomi's, as if testing whether the world would shift beneath him or hold steady. And Naomi kept her hand exactly as it was, warm, unmoving, offering presence without tightening, without claiming, allowing him to decide how long the moment would last. While the soft hum of the ballroom seemed to fall further away, replaced by the faint sound of Ethan's breathing as it steadied into something calmer, something grounded, and Richard stood just behind him, his posture no longer rigid but not yet relaxed, caught somewhere between instinct and realization, his gaze fixed on the small, simple action unfolding in front of him that carried more weight than any deal he had ever closed. And he felt it then, not as a sudden understanding, but as a slow, heavy shift. The recognition that everything he had tried before had missed something essential, something he had never known how to give. And as Ethan's fingers pressed just slightly more firmly against Naomi's hand, a subtle change but unmistakable, Naomi's thumb moved almost imperceptibly beneath his, not gripping, not guiding, just acknowledging his presence with the smallest, gentlest motion, and Ethan did not pull away. Instead, his shoulders lowered further, the tension draining from his frame in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar to his own body, as if he were discovering a new way to exist in a space that had always felt overwhelming. And a quiet murmur began to ripple through the nearby guests who had been watching from a distance, their curiosity no longer hidden, their expressions shifting from polite detachment to something closer to wonder, though none of them fully understood what they were seeing. And Richard noticed them then, the attention, the whispers, the subtle turning of heads, and for a brief second the old instinct returned, the need to manage the room, to control perception, to reclaim authority, but it faded just as quickly as it came, because this moment did not belong to them, did not belong to appearances or expectations. It belonged entirely to the boy standing in front of him and the woman who had chosen to meet him exactly where he was. And Naomi slowly shifted her position, not closer, not further, just enough to ease the pressure on her legs against the marble floor, her movements careful, deliberate, ensuring that nothing about the connection was disrupted, her voice soft once more, almost like a breath carried on the air. You can let go whenever you want. The words gentle, freeing, removing even the smallest sense of obligation, and Ethan's fingers twitched slightly at that, not withdrawing but adjusting, as if testing the idea of choice itself. And for a brief second he looked up, not fully, not directly, but enough that his gaze brushed past Naomi's face, catching a glimpse of her expression, calm, patient, unafraid, and something in that unguarded stillness seemed to settle deeper within him, his grip remaining, his breathing steady, his presence anchored in a way that had not been possible before. While behind them, Richard took a slow step back without realizing it, creating space not because he was told to, but because he understood. Finally, that space was what had always been needed, and as the light from the chandeliers softened against the polished marble, reflecting the quiet connection between two people who had no reason to trust each other, yet somehow did, the world Richard thought he controlled continued to shift in silence, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, something he had never learned until now, and could not ignore any longer. The contact remained, quiet and steady, stretching into something that no longer felt fragile but deeply present, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of a moment that could not be rushed. And Naomi's hand stayed beneath Ethan's with the same calm consistency, her breathing even, her posture grounded, allowing the silence to do the work that words never could, while the world around them seemed to recede further into the background, the music now a distant echo, the soft glow of the chandeliers blurring into warm halos of light that reflected across the marble floor like fragments of something distant and unreachable. And Ethan's shoulders lowered another fraction, the tension that had once held his body rigid now dissolving into something softer, something almost peaceful. his fingers no longer tentative but resting fully against Naomi's hand, as if he had found a place that did not demand anything from him, a place that simply existed and allowed him to exist with it. And Naomi did not move to change it, did not tighten her hold or guide him further. She simply remained, her presence unwavering, her eyes gentle but unfocused in a way that did not pressure him to respond, as though she understood that being seen did not always require being looked at directly. And behind them Richard stood in a stillness that felt unfamiliar, his mind no longer racing to fix or manage but slowing, piece by piece, as he watched something unfold that he had never been able to create. And in that quiet observation something within him shifted, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a gradual, undeniable way, as he began to see the pattern he had missed for years, the way his son did not need instruction or correction in these moments but space, patience, and a kind of presence that did not overwhelm. And the realization settled heavily in his chest, not as regret yet, but as awareness, as the first step towards something he had not known he needed to learn, while the faint sound of Ethan's breathing now carried a steady rhythm that matched Naomi's, the two patterns aligning in a subtle harmony that required no acknowledgement. And the room, once filled with expectation and quiet judgment, seemed to soften at its edges, the people within it no longer leaning forward with curiosity, but standing back, as if instinctively recognizing that what they were witnessing did not belong to them, could not be interrupted or explained. And Naomi shifted her gaze just slightly, not toward Ethan but toward the space between them, maintaining that delicate balance where nothing was demanded and everything was possible. And Ethan's grip adjusted again, not loosening but settling, as though his body had finally found a position that felt right, his weight evenly distributed, his breathing calm, his presence no longer pulled in multiple directions. And Richard took another small step back, the movement almost imperceptible but intentional, creating more space, not out of uncertainty now but out of understanding. And for the first time he allowed the moment to exist without trying to shape it, without trying to control its outcome. And as the light shifted slightly overhead, casting a softer glow across the floor, the quiet connection between Naomi and Ethan remained, unbroken, unforced, a simple, steady presence that carried more meaning than anything spoken in that room. And in that stillness, something deeper took root, something that would not fade when the moment ended, something that would follow them beyond this space, beyond this night, into a reality that would no longer look the same. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the space like something alive and breathing. And in that stillness Ethan's hand remained in Naomi's, no longer tentative, no longer searching, but present in a way that felt complete, as if the question he had been asking without words had finally found its answer. And Naomi did nothing to change it, her hand steady, her posture unchanged, allowing the moment to belong entirely to him, while Richard stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center of the scene he once controlled, his gaze fixed on his son with a clarity that had never fully reached him before. And something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, as the pieces began to connect in a way they never had, not through analysis, not through strategy, but through observation of something real, something he could not manufacture. And he saw it then, not just what Naomi had done, but what she had not done, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation, the absence of control. And that absence was exactly what had allowed his son to step forward on his own. And the realization struck deeper than any mistake he had ever corrected, because it revealed not a single failure but a pattern, years of trying to guide Ethan toward a world that overwhelmed him instead of meeting him where he was. And as that understanding settled, heavy and quiet, Ethan's fingers shifted again, not pulling away but adjusting with intention, his grip now certain, his shoulders relaxed, his breathing calm. And for the first time since entering the room he lifted his gaze fully, not to Naomi, not to the bracelet, but beyond, his eyes moving slowly until they met his father's. And the moment held there, fragile and immense, because it was not just a glance, it was recognition, a bridge that had not existed before. And Richard felt it in a way that left no room for denial, the truth unfolding in silence, that his son was not unreachable, not distant in the way he had believed, but waiting for something he had never been given. And the weight of that understanding pressed into him with a quiet force, reshaping something deeper than pride or certainty. And he did not move forward, did not speak, because he understood now that this was not his moment to claim, but his moment to witness. And Naomi sensed the shift without looking, the connection extending beyond the two of them into something larger, something that included the man standing behind the child, and she slowly, gently turned her hand just enough to allow Ethan's fingers to rest more comfortably, not guiding, not leading, simply adjusting to support what he had chosen, and Ethan did not pull away. Instead, he stepped slightly closer, closing the last invisible distance, his presence steady, grounded, and in that quiet, unspoken exchange, everything that had been misunderstood began to realign, not with words, not with explanation, but with a truth that could only be felt. And as the light above softened against the polished floor, reflecting three figures now instead of two, the moment became something more than a connection. It became a revelation, one that would not disappear when the music returned or the night moved on, but one that would remain, reshaping everything that came after. Richard did not move immediately, even after Ethan's gaze met his, even after the quiet truth of that moment settled into something undeniable, because for the first time in years he understood that stepping forward too quickly could break something fragile that had just begun to form. And so he remained where he was, a few steps back, his presence no longer pressing into the space but existing at its edge, watching as his son stood beside Naomi with a calm that had never come easily. And the realization did not arrive as a single thought but as a slow unfolding, a recognition that everything he had believed about strength, about guidance, about what it meant to protect his child, had been incomplete. And Naomi, still seated on the marble floor, felt that shift without needing to see it, the change in the air, the absence of resistance, the quiet permission that now existed where there had once been control. And she allowed a small breath to release from her chest, not in relief but in acknowledgement, as if marking the moment where something had turned, and Ethan's hand remained in hers, steady, grounded, his fingers no longer searching but resting. His body aligned in a way that suggested he had found something familiar in a place that had never been familiar before. And Richard finally took a step forward, slow and measured, not reclaiming space but entering it carefully, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. And when he stopped, it was not beside his son but a short distance away, close enough to be present but far enough to not disrupt what had been built. And his voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard it, stripped of authority, stripped of command, carrying something new, something uncertain but real. Thank you. The words simple, unembellished, offered not as a performance, but as an acknowledgement of something he could not yet fully explain. And Naomi did not look up right away. She did not respond immediately, because the moment did not require conversation, it required continuation. And after a brief pause, she gently shifted her hand just enough to allow Ethan the space to decide what came next, her voice soft as she spoke. He did this, placing the truth exactly where it belonged, not taking credit, not accepting praise, but redirecting the meaning back to the one who had made the choice. And Richard felt that too. The correction, the quiet reminder that this was not about her action but about his son's ability, something he had underestimated for too long. And he nodded once, a small movement but filled with weight, as if accepting a lesson he had not known he needed. And Ethan glanced between them, not fully understanding the exchange of words but sensing the change in tone, the shift in energy, and his hand tightened slightly in Naomi's before slowly, carefully, releasing, not abruptly, not out of discomfort, but with intention, as if he now understood that connection did not disappear when contact ended. And Naomi allowed her hand to remain open for a moment longer before resting it back against her lap, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm. And Richard exhaled, a quiet, steady breath that seemed to carry something away with it, something rigid, something old, and in its place something new began to settle, not fully formed, not yet understood, but undeniable. And as the room slowly returned to its normal rhythm, the music rising again, the conversations resuming, nothing felt the same, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would follow them beyond this night, beyond this room, into every moment that came after, shaping not just what Richard would do next, but who he would become in the presence of the child he was finally beginning to see. The night did not end with applause or announcement. It faded quietly, almost unnoticed, as if the world understood that something too delicate had taken place to be framed by noise, and the ballroom slowly returned to its rhythm. Conversations rebuilding themselves in soft layers, glasses lifted, music rising again beneath the glow of chandeliers. Yet the space where it had happened remained different, carrying a stillness that did not fully disappear, and Naomi stood up at last, her movements calm and unhurried, smoothing the fabric of her uniform as she stepped back into her role without drawing attention to herself, as if what had happened belonged to no one, and yet had changed everything. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture steady, his breathing even, his gaze following her briefly before shifting back to his father, not with uncertainty this time, but with a quiet awareness, as though something inside him had settled into place, and Richard met that look without hesitation, not reaching immediately, not speaking, but allowing the connection to exist without forcing it forward. And after a moment he extended his hand, not as a command, not as a direction, but as an option, open, patient, mirroring something he had only just learned. And Ethan looked at it, considered it, then slowly stepped closer, his fingers brushing against his father's before resting there lightly, not gripping, not pulling away, simply choosing, and Richard felt it. The difference, subtle but unmistakable, the absence of resistance, the presence of trust, and he did not tighten his hold, did not guide. He simply stood there with him, allowing the moment to breathe, and across the room Naomi moved quietly between tables. Again, her presence blending back into the background, unnoticed by most, yet carrying something that could not be erased. And as the night wore on, the lights dimmed slightly, the crowd thinning, the polished marble reflecting fewer footsteps, until eventually the room emptied into silence, leaving behind only the faint echo of what had occurred. And later, as the first light of morning began to slip through the tall windows, soft and pale against the floor, Richard stood alone for a moment at the edge of the room, watching as Ethan sat calmly near the window, tracing patterns in the light with his fingers, something he had not done in years without distress. And the quiet in that scene felt different, not empty, not heavy, but full, like something had been restored in a way that could not be measured or explained. And Richard's gaze shifted toward the doorway where Naomi had exited hours before, her absence now carrying a presence of its own. And he did not call after her, did not send someone to bring her back, because he understood now that what she had given was not something that could be owned or requested again on command. It was something that had been offered freely, in the exact moment it was needed. And as he turned back toward his son, stepping closer but not too close, the morning light catching in his eyes, he allowed the silence to settle around them, not as something to fill, but as something to listen to. And in that quiet, with no words,